We're talking about the 5 best Fidelity index funds that you can invest into to make more money. Here we go. The first is the Fidelity 500 Index Fund. This index fund invests in stocks that are included in the S&P 500 index, which is the main index that investors use to gauge how well the entire stock market is doing. As in the name, it includes around 500 of the largest US companies. With top holdings like Apple, Microsoft, a lot of these companies that are in this fund are familiar to you in your day-to-day life. The average return for the fund since its inception is around 10.42%, which means $10,000 invested in 2018 will be worth $16,414 today. As far as cost, it's really cheap with an expense ratio of 0.015%. So for every $10,000 invested, you would only have to pay $1.50 per year. It's also heavily weighted in large cap companies. So if you're looking for reliability and stability in your portfolio, this is a great fund that you can look into. Large cap companies are companies that have a valuation of at least $10 billion and will usually be companies that you recognize by name, like Google or Alphabet, Apple, Netflix, and Tesla. Sounds pretty good so far, right? Well, there's some things that we need to consider with this index fund. Since the fund is 100% reliant on US stocks, its performance is 100% reliant on how well our market and our economy is doing as a whole. If our stock market is doing well, you'll be happy with this index fund. But if the market takes a downturn like it did in 2022, then your account will see that same type of downfall as well. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Every market goes up and down, but it is something that you need to be aware of, so you don't get anxious or get impatient when we do have those years and we do have those periods to where the market might not be as hot as it has been in the past. The next is the Fidelity Total Market Index Fund. This fund invests in stocks that are included in the Dow Jones Index, which is viewed as a broad market index for domestic stocks and has a lot more stocks included in it compared to something like the S&P 500. So as you can see, this fund is still a large cap blend, but it includes almost 4,000 stocks compared to the 500 or so stocks in FXAIX. Again, some of these names will be very familiar to you, like Apple, Microsoft, Alphabet, formerly known as Google, and the average return is 8%, which means $10,000 invested in 2018 will be worth $14,693 today. Now you may be thinking,
but Brian G, that's not a lot of money for 5 years.
Which I can't blame you for thinking that, but there's a few things you need to consider with this number I just gave you as far as the amount of returns that you would have in these 5 years. The first is assuming that you would only invest $10,000 in 2018 and you wouldn't invest $1 more in these whole 5 years, which I know you wouldn't be doing that. The next is that this fund is heavily diversified and it holds a boatload of stocks. Since you have many different stocks in this fund, they all don't perform the same way at the same time. So it creates more of a balance, whether that be a limited upside or also a limited downside as well. So it really depends on what you're comfortable with and what your goals are. As far as the cost, again, this expense ratio is 0.015%, which is really cheap. So for every $10,000 invested per year, you'll be paying $1.50. So we have a great expense ratio, we're heavily diversified, it has pretty decent returns since its inception. What could be the problem with this fund? Well, again, compared to even the last fund that we mentioned, this is heavily invested in domestic stocks. So its performance is going to be directly correlated to how well our market does as a whole and nothing else. Even though it is heavily diversified, that's not a magic solution to prevent any downturns in your portfolio, and this fund is no exception. The next is the Fidelity Mid Cap Index Fund. This fund invests into stocks that are included in the Russell Mid Cap Index, which includes about 800 companies with a valuation of between $2 billion and $10 billion. If you remember before, we mentioned that large cap companies are any companies that have at least $10 billion valuation or higher. So it's easy to think about mid cap stocks like this. Small cap stocks have a low valuation, but they have the potential for a lot of upside. But at the same time, they also have the potential for a lot of risk. Large cap companies are very stable, very reliable, but their upside is a bit limited because these are mammoth sized companies and it's very hard to grow them a lot further at times. Mid caps are a blend of the two. So you get some potential for upside, but then you get a little bit of stability as well. So there are a little over 800 stocks included in this fund, with top holdings like Phillips 66, O'Reilly Automotive, and Ross Stores. As far as cost, the expense ratio is 0.025%. So for every $10,000 invested per year, you'll be paying $2.50. The average return since its inception is a little over 12%, which means $10,000 invested in 2018 will be worth $17,623 $10,000 today. So this fund has the highest return that we mentioned so far. The expense ratio is still really good. So what could be wrong with this fund? Since it is a mid-cap fund, it will create some volatility in your portfolio, which can be good or bad depending on what your goals are. But honestly, it's not really a great strategy to just invest into one fund at a time. You would kind of want to mix and blend these funds together to create an even more diversified portfolio. If you were 100% invested into this mid-cap index fund, you might be on some roller coasters here and there. But if it's just a part of your portfolio, then it can give you that upside capability that you may be looking for. The next is the Fidelity International Index Fund. This fund invests in stocks included in the Morgan Stanley Capital International Europe Index, which represents the company performance in foreign stock markets. So you may be thinking, why would I want to invest in an international index fund? There are a couple of reasons. The first is that international markets typically don't rise and fall at the same time that our markets do here in the States. So having an international fund can help to create some balance. When our market may be doing bad here, you have the chance to do well in the international market. And also to help spread the risk in your portfolio instead of being 100% invested in domestic stocks. Now there are two types of international markets: developed markets and emerging markets. Developed markets are located in countries that have established industries, solid infrastructure, secure economies, and a relatively high standard of living. And examples of these countries might be Japan, United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and France. Now the emerging markets are in countries that are developing markets but might be less stable, but they're considered to be transitioning into developed markets. Examples of emerging markets might be countries like India, China, South Africa, Mexico, and Russia. Emerging markets have a wider range of possibilities compared to developed markets, so you have to keep that in mind when you're investing in international funds. So this fund holds over 800 stocks, and roughly 60% of the fund is invested in companies that are located in Japan, the UK, France, and Switzerland, which are all developed markets, with top holdings like Shell and Nestle. Now for the cost, the expense ratio is a little bit higher than what we've talked about previously, and this one is 0.035%. So for every $10,000 invested per year, you'll be paying $3.50. Since the fund's inception, it averages around 5% in returns. So $10,000 invested in 2018 would be around $12,762 today. As you can see, the returns are not as high compared to other funds that we've mentioned previously in this video, but if you're interested in international markets, in my opinion, this fund is the best one that you can get from Fidelity if you want to be invested internationally. So what are the concerns with this fund? Well, obviously the main concern is that it is an international fund. Many times other countries, just like we do here at times, have a lot of issues that are out of our control, whether that be political or social and economic, which can have a big impact on their market. So there's some increased risk by investing in international funds, because now you're not just talking about the company and their success, you're actually talking about the country and their region as a whole now. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to invest into this fund. The next is the Fidelity NASDAQ Composite Index Fund. This fund, just like in the name, invests into companies that are included in the NASDAQ. Now the NASDAQ index is an index that holds over around 3,700 stocks, but a little more than half of the index is tech stocks. So for it still being an index fund, this index fund is very tech heavy. Now this fund holds over 3,400 or so stocks, but a little over 40% of this fund is Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Tesla, and Meta, which is formerly known as Facebook. Now the average return for this fund is around 11%. So $10,000 invested in 2018 will be worth around $16,850 today. Now for the cost. The expense ratio is 0.37%. So for $10,000 invested per year, you'll be paying $37. Now I know you're thinking again,
But Brian G, why are you recommending this fund with this high expense ratio?
and it's really due to the potential returns, and we'll talk about that in a minute. If you look at the 10-year average, you will see the average return around 15%, which is very good and very high for an index fund. But if you look around 3 and 5 years, you'll see that the average is around 10%. So why wouldn't it be the same for 10 years? And a lot of it has to do with how these stocks, especially these tech stocks, had record-breaking years during the pandemic. So this average return for its inception is a bit skewed, especially as of recently, because a lot of these tech stocks have been having a pretty rough time. But as I mentioned before, every market goes up and down, and that includes job markets as well. And tech stocks have the capability to provide some pretty aggressive returns. So what are the concerns with this fund? The first is definitely the expense ratio. For an index fund, this is a pretty high expense ratio ratio, but you do have the ability to get some pretty high upside. And the second is the volatility, because the vast majority is only made up of a few companies. If these companies do well, then this fund will do well. So out of all the 5, which one should you choose? The goal for investing is always to diversify as best as you can, but also to try to get as much upside as you can. So the Fidelity S&P 500 index and the Fidelity Total Stock Market Index are 2 great options for you to start building around in your portfolio. And the choice is really up to you, but I'll just say that a large percentage of my portfolio is in the S&P 500 index fund. So that's what I have for you today. If you like the video, please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this.